Look, lady, I don't know who you are, but this is a marine bar. You're taking up valuable real estate. Why don't you and your glass of water go find a book club somewhere? The crowd laughed. It was a jagged, ugly sound, amplified by the cheap beer and the humid Virginia air that clung to the inside of the globe and anchor like a wet shroud. The man who spoke, a sergeant with shoulders as wide as his assumptions, leaned over the sticky oak bar, his face a mask of performative condescension. He was young, sculpted by the relentless demands of the Corps, and he wore his arrogance like a freshly pressed uniform. He saw a woman in her late 40s, dressed in a simple gray silk blouse and dark slacks, her hair tied back in a neat, unassuming bun. He saw no rank, no insignia, no hint of the world he inhabited. He saw an outsider, a civilian, a soft target for the casual cruelty that passed for camaraderie in a place like this. But the woman, Evelyn Hayes, did not react. Her gaze, which had been sweeping across the boisterous room with a practiced, analytical calm, did not even flicker in his direction. Her hands remained steady around her glass, her posture unchanged. She was a granite island in a sea of testosterone-fueled noise, and his insults washed over her without leaving a trace. It was this silence, this profound lack of engagement, that seemed to infuriate the sergeant more than any retort could have. He saw weakness. He saw dismissiveness. What he failed to see was the quiet, humming engine of a mind that processed threats on a global scale, that weighed the fates of fleets with the same methodical calm she now applied to his juvenile posturing. He could not know that her unremarkable appearance was a form of camouflage she had perfected over a lifetime of operating in environments where being underestimated was her most potent weapon. But across the room, leaning against a doorframe leading to a private back office, a four-star general had just emerged, drawn by the swell of laughter. He didn't hear the insult, not clearly, but he saw the tableau, the loud, preening sergeant and the still, silent woman. And when the general saw her stance, the subtle, perfect distribution of her weight, the way her eyes never stopped their slow, constant scan of the room's exits and inhabitants, a flicker of something ancient and deeply respectful crossed his face. He saw not a civilian, but a professional. He saw a posture he hadn't seen in 20 years, a posture taught in only one place to only one kind of person. He saw a ghost from a past he thought was buried in classified reports and redacted histories. If you believe that true strength doesn't need to announce itself, that competence is its own credential, and that respect is a currency earned in silence and paid in action, type respect below. This sergeant was about to learn that lesson. The entire United States Marine Corps was about to learn it with him. The lesson would not be taught with words, but with a demonstration of skill so profound, so undeniable, that would be etched into the very folklore of the institution he so arrogantly claimed to represent. The air in the bar was thick with stories, most of them embellished, all of them loud. Tales of Paris Island, of Fallujah, of training exercises in the blistering heat of 29 Palms, all competed for sonic dominance. It was the unofficial parliament of the enlisted, a place where legends were born and reputations were forged in the crucible of braggadocio. Sergeant Miller, the self-appointed gatekeeper of this sacred space, was a master of its particular language. He held court, his voice a booming baritone that cut through the lesser chatter, his audience a rotating cast of younger, impressionable Marines who saw in him the embodiment of the warrior ethos. His contempt for the quiet woman was, in his mind, a defense of that ethos. This place was for them, for the initiated, for those who had earned their place through sweat and sacrifice. Her serene presence was an affront, a dilution of the potent brew of identity that sustained them. He continued his tirade, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Seriously, Mom, we're trying to decompress here. You're Hersheying the vibe. Did you get lost on your way to the Congressional Spouses Luncheon? More laughter, this time a little more nervous, a little less certain. Some of the older Marines, the ones with more than one war etched into the lines around their eyes, shifted uncomfortably. They knew this kind of bravado often preceded a fall. They didn't know why, but the woman's stillness was beginning to feel less like weakness and more like immense, coiled potential. Evelyn, meanwhile, was cataloging. The fire suppression system was outdated. The exits were partially blocked by a stack of beer kegs, a clear violation of fire code. The bartender had a slight tremor in his left hand, possibly early onset Parkinson's, or maybe just exhaustion. She noted the tribalism of the room, the way the infantry Marines clustered together, separate from the logistics and admin personnel. She saw the social architecture of the Corps laid bare, a living, breathing organism of pride and prejudice. Her mind, trained to deconstruct complex systems and identify critical vulnerabilities, did so automatically, effortlessly. This was not a bar. It was a human terrain map. She had come here not for a drink, but for this very purpose: to observe, to understand the pulse of the force she was charged with leading, far from the sterile briefing rooms of the Pentagon. The official reports told one story. The unfiltered atmosphere of a place like the Globe and Anchor told another, often more truthful one. Sergeant Miller, mistaking her analytical gaze for disinterest, saw his final opening for public humiliation. "All right, that's it," he declared, stepping away from the bar and placing himself directly in her path. "Time to go. I'm sure there's a PDA meeting you're missing." He made a move as if to put a hand on her arm, a gesture of patronizing, physical dismissal. But he never made contact. Something in her eyes, a sudden shift from passive observation to diamond-hard focus, stopped him cold. It was a look that contained multitudes of authority, of danger, of a capacity for decisive action that he had never encountered in his life. The laughter in the room died instantly. Every eye was now fixed on the silent standoff. The quiet woman had finally, without a word, responded. And her response was a silence more powerful, more intimidating than any shout. The tension in the air became a physical thing, a palpable pressure that silenced the jukebox and froze drinks halfway to lips. It was in this supercharged silence that the universe chose to intervene, to provide a stage for the lesson that needed to be taught. It began with a cough, a wet, ragged sound from a corner booth. An older man, a retired master gunnery sergeant with a chest full of ribbons and a face like a roadmap of forgotten conflicts, suddenly slumped forward, his face turning a deep, alarming shade of purple. He clawed at his throat, his eyes wide with panic. The spell was broken, replaced by a new, more visceral kind of chaos. Men shouted. Someone yelled a call, 911. A young corporal, trying to help, began slapping the choking man on the back, a well-intentioned but useless gesture. Panic is a contagion, and it spread through the room with frightening speed. Men trained to face enemy fire with icy calm were reduced to a stammering, helpless crowd. They were warriors, not medics. Their skills were for breaking things, not mending them. But through this maelstrom of fear and confusion, one figure moved with an almost supernatural calm. Evelyn Hayes placed her water glass on the bar with a soft, deliberate click. She moved not with haste, but with a chilling efficiency, her path to the corner booth weaving through the panicked Marines as if they were stationary objects. There was no debate in her movement, no hesitation. There was only purpose. Sergeant Miller, who had been frozen by her silent rebuke, was now simply in her way. She didn't shove him. She didn't even speak to him. She simply occupied the space he was in, forcing him to stumble backward, his arrogance forgotten, replaced by a dumbfounded awe. He watched as she reached the booth, her hands already working. "Lay him down, flat." Her voice was not loud, but possessed a quality of absolute command that cut through the noise like a surgeon's scalpel. The Marines nearest the booth, desperate for direction, obeyed instantly, helping the old master gunnery sergeant to the floor. She knelt beside him, her fingers immediately finding the carotid artery in his neck. "No pulse," she stated, not to anyone in particular, but as a clinical observation. "He's in full cardiac arrest. Asphyxia-induced," the technical terms, spoken with such matter-of-fact authority, further silenced the room. This was not a concerned bystander. This was an expert in her element. Her eyes scanned the table. A steak knife, a cloth napkin, a half-empty bottle of whiskey. In the hands of anyone else, it was debris. In her hands, it became a field surgical kit. She took the napkin, poured the whiskey over the knife's blade, the alcohol serving as a crude, sterilizing agent. The room held its collective breath, the only sounds now the distant wail of approaching sirens and the woman's calm, rhythmic breathing. Sergeant Miller watched, his jaw slack, as she tilted the old man's head back, her fingers probing the soft tissue of his throat. He was witnessing a level of competence, of grace under pressure, that he had only ever read about in citations for the Medal of Honor. The woman he had dismissed as a soft, irrelevant civilian was now holding the line between life and death on the grimy floor of a bar, and she was doing it with the focus of a bomb disposal technician. His world, with its rigid, simple hierarchies of strength and weakness, was being dismantled before his very eyes. The action that followed was a blur of brutal, precise efficiency. Evelyn, no, not Evelyn, but the professional who wore her identity like a shell, made a swift, decisive incision in the master gunnery sergeant's throat. A cricothyrotomy, a desperate, last-ditch procedure to create an airway when the upper passage is blocked. It was a textbook maneuver executed with a speed and confidence that bespoke hundreds, if not thousands, of hours of practice. There was no wasted motion. She used the handle of the steak knife to pry open the small incision, then took a simple drinking straw from a nearby glass, snipped the end with her teeth, and inserted it into the opening. It was a crude, improvised endotracheal tube, but it was enough. She leaned down, placed her mouth over the end of the straw, and began to breathe for the man. One breath. Two. The room was a vacuum of sound. Every Marine stood frozen, witnesses to an act of medical savagery and grace that defied everything they understood. They watched as the old man's chest rose and fell with her breaths. They saw the ghastly purple color of his skin begin to recede, replaced by a pale but living pink. A moment later, his body convulsed, and he coughed violently, expelling the piece of steak that had been lodged in his windpipe. He took a shuddering, ragged breath on his own, then another. The silence in the bar was finally broken by a collective, ragged sigh of relief, as if every man in the room had been holding his breath with the dying veteran. The paramedics burst through the door a moment later, their arrival almost an anticlimax. They found a scene of impossible order amidst the chaos. A woman kneeling calmly over a breathing patient, an improvised airway perfectly in place, the patient's vital signs already stabilizing. The lead paramedic, a grizzled man who had seen everything the city could throw at him, stopped short. He took in the scene, the knife, the straw, the perfect incision, and his professional eyes widened in disbelief. Who did the crick? He asked, his voice filled with a reverence that bordered on awe. Evelyn looked up, her face serene, her blouse spattered with a few drops of blood. He had a complete obstruction. There was no other option, she said, her voice a quiet, clinical report. She began to relay the patient's condition, the sequence of events, the exact time of cardiac arrest and resuscitation, using precise medical terminology that the paramedics understood perfectly. She was no longer just a civilian. She was a peer, an expert. Sergeant Miller, standing by the bar, felt a cold wave of nausea wash over him. The sheer, overwhelming force of her competence was a physical blow. He had mocked her. He had tried to eject her from a place he considered sacred ground. And she, in response, had saved the life of one of its most revered elders. The irony was a bitter acid in his stomach. His loud, empty pride had been exposed for what it was, the braying of an ignorant child. Her quiet, unassuming presence had been revealed as the calm center of a universe of skill and knowledge he couldn't begin to comprehend. The demonstration was over. The lesson had been delivered, and all that was left was the deafening silence of his own spectacular public shame. As the paramedics carefully loaded the now stable master gunnery sergeant onto a gurney, the crowd of Marines parted, forming a silent, respectful corridor. They weren't looking at the paramedics or the veteran they were saving. All eyes were on the woman, who now stood and calmly wiped her hands with a clean napkin offered by the shell-shocked bartender. She was once again the unassuming civilian, yet everything about her had changed in their eyes. The space around her seemed to hum with a newfound authority, an aura of gravitas that had been there all along, invisible only to those blinded by their own assumptions. It was into this charged atmosphere that the general stepped forward. General Wallace, The 38th Commandant of the Marine Corps moved from the shadows of the back room into the main bar. He was a man whose presence naturally commanded respect, a living symbol of the institution. But tonight, he was not the one being deferred to. He walked directly to the woman, his eyes missing nothing. The blood on her sleeve, the calm set of her jaw, the improvised surgical tools still lying on the table. He stopped 2 feet in front of her, his posture ramrod straight. The bar, which had begun to fill with a low murmur of conversation, fell silent once more. Everyone knew what was coming. A reprimand for the sergeant, perhaps. A word of thanks to the woman. But no one was prepared for what happened next. General Wallace, a man who received salutes from thousands but gave them to only a handful, drew himself up to his full height. He executed the single most precise, powerful, and reverent salute of his storied career. It was a gesture of profound deference, an acknowledgement of authority that transcended the visible markers of rank. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low, respectful rumble that carried to every corner of the room. "Secretary Hayes, I apologize for the conduct of my Marine." It will be addressed. The 2 words, Secretary Hayes, landed in the room like a perfectly placed munition, a concussive blast of revelation that shattered every last assumption. Secretary, the Secretary of the Navy, the highest-ranking civilian official in charge of both the Navy and the Marine Corps. The woman Sergeant Miller had tried to throw out of a bar was, in a very real sense, his ultimate commanding officer. She commanded the entire naval force, from the rawest recruit at Paris Island to the 4-star admirals commanding fleets across the globe. The collective gasp in the room was audible. Jaws literally dropped. Sergeant Miller felt the floor dissolve beneath his feet. He swayed, his face ashen, his mind struggling to process the enormity of his mistake. He hadn't just insulted a civilian. He had publicly humiliated the civilian leader of the entire Department of the Navy. The woman he called Lady was a person whose name was on the orders that sent entire divisions to war. It was a career-ending, life-altering level of catastrophic misjudgment. Secretary Hayes simply looked at the general, a flicker of acknowledgement in her eyes. "It's already been addressed, General," she said, her voice calm and even. She offered a slight, formal nod, the civilian equivalent of returning his salute. The gesture was one of grace, of moving on, but it only deepened the chasm between her station and Miller's foolishness. She held the power to end his career with a single word, and instead, she had chosen to dismiss the entire affair as a non-issue. This act of quiet magnanimity was, in its own way, more devastating to Miller's pride than any official punishment could ever be. It relegated his monumental transgression to a minor inconvenience, unworthy of her further attention. The general held his salute for a moment longer, a silent testament to his respect, before crisply dropping his hand. He turned his gaze, now as cold and hard as chipped granite, towards Sergeant Miller. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. He simply looked at him, and in that look, Miller saw the full weight of the institution he had so poorly represented. The general understood something profound in that moment. He knew of Secretary Hayes's official biography, of course. A Rhodes Scholar, a brilliant legal mind, a shrewd political operator who had climbed to one of the highest offices in the nation's defense establishment. But he also knew the rumors, the classified whispers that circulated at the highest levels of command. The story was that before her life in law and politics, Evelyn Hayes had been someone else entirely. She had been a commissioned officer in the Navy, a physician who had volunteered for one of the most dangerous and secretive assignments available, a field surgeon attached to a Naval Special Warfare Development Group, the unit more commonly known as SEAL Team 6. She had served in the shadows, her skills honed in the crucible of clandestine operations, patching up the nation's most elite warriors in the most hostile environments on Earth. The cricothyrotomy she had performed with a steak knife and a drinking straw wasn't just a clever improvisation. It was a muscle memory, a procedure she had likely performed under fire, with a whistle of bullets for soundtrack. The general looked at her hands, steady, competent, and now clean, and he saw not a politician, but a quiet professional of the highest caliber. He saw a fellow warrior, one who had simply traded her scalpel and fatigues for a pen and a business suit, but who had never lost the core of who she was. His salute was not just for the Secretary of the Navy. It was for the ghost of the combat surgeon who still lived inside her. "Someone get the secretary a clean shirt," the general ordered, his voice still low but now carrying the unmistakable edge of command. An aide scrambled to comply. "And someone get Sergeant Miller a new assignment. I'm thinking weather observation. In Antarctica. Starting tomorrow." The sentence was delivered deadpan, but its message was clear. While the secretary might have dismissed the incident, the commandant of the Marine Corps would not. The institution would police its own. Accountability would be rendered. Yet, it was Secretary Hayes who intervened again. "General, with all due respect," she said, her voice drawing the attention of everyone in the room, including the now trembling Miller. "Leave the sergeant where he is. He's about to become the most effective object lesson in humility this base has ever seen. That's more valuable to the Corps than an extra weather report from the South Pole." Her words were a strategic masterstroke. She wasn't just forgiving Miller. She was repurposing him. She was turning his shame into a teachable moment, a living testament to the dangers of assumption. She was thinking not of punishment, but of the long-term health and culture of the force. It was the decision of a true leader, one who understood that building a better institution was more important than settling a personal score. The general considered her words, then gave a slow, appreciative nod. He understood. The lesson wouldn't be in the punishment, but in the redemption. Sergeant Miller would have to face his peers every day, knowing they all knew his story. He would have to live with his mistake, and in doing so, he would become a walking, talking reminder to every Marine at Quantico. Never judge a book by its cover, because that quiet, unassuming civilian might just be the one who signs your checks, commands your fleets, and knows how to save your life with a bar straw. The legend of that night spread not like wildfire, but like a slow-moving, deeply penetrating pressure wave. It wasn't just gossip. It was a modern-day parable that resonated with the core values the Marine Corps espoused, but sometimes failed to practice. The story, which became known as the Secretary's Crick, was told in barracks, in chow halls, on long marches, and in the hushed confines of ready rooms. It was a story about competence, humility, and the hidden nature of strength. It became a powerful corrective to the culture of superficial judgment, a reminder that the most formidable individuals were often the ones who felt no need to advertise their capabilities. For Sergeant Miller, the aftermath was a crucible. The general, following the secretary's lead, did not transfer him. He was forced to remain, to face the quiet stares, the whispered conversations, the sudden silences that fell when he entered a room. The first week was unbearable, a gauntlet of shame. His former acolytes avoided him. His superiors watched him with a mixture of pity and contempt. He was a pariah. But then, something began to shift, both around him and within him. The story began to change in the telling. It became less about his humiliation and more about Secretary Hayes's incredible skill and grace. The focus shifted from his arrogance to her quiet professionalism. Miller, stripped of his bravado, was forced into a period of profound introspection. He replayed the night over and over in his mind. Not his own foolish words, but the image of her calm, methodical movements amidst the chaos. He saw the absolute certainty in her hands, the utter lack of ego in her actions. She hadn't saved the master gunnery sergeant to prove a point to him. She had done it because it was necessary, and she was capable. The distinction was critical. He began to research her, devouring every public article he could find. He read about her academic achievements, her legal career, her swift rise through the civilian ranks of the Department of Defense. And then he dug deeper, using his clearance to access internal, unclassified biographies. He found a single, redacted line: active duty service, United States Navy, 1995 to 2003. Details classified. That single line confirmed what the general's salute had implied. She was one of them, but from a world far more demanding and secretive than any he had ever known. The humility this realization forced upon him was absolute. It burned away his arrogance, leaving behind a raw, sincere desire for redemption. A month after the incident, he sought out the master gunnery sergeant he had watched her save. The old man was back at the bar, a fresh scar on his throat, drinking a non-alcoholic beer. Miller approached him, his posture no longer proud, but deferential. He apologized for his behavior that night, for his role in creating a tense and disrespectful atmosphere. The old Marine just looked at him, took a slow sip, and said, "Son, that woman didn't just save my life. She saved this whole damn bar from its own stupidity. Don't you forget it, Miller didn't." He changed. The booming voice was replaced by a more considered tone. The arrogant posturing was replaced by a quiet watchfulness. He started listening more than he spoke. He began to look for the quiet professionals around him, the ones who got the job done without needing fanfare. He discovered they were everywhere. The logistics chief who kept the supplies flowing seamlessly, the armorer who could diagnose a rifle malfunction by sound alone, the comm specialist who could make a radio work in the middle of a hurricane. His definition of strength was being completely rewritten. He learned that true competence was a language spoken not with the mouth, but with the hands, with action, with results. The bar owner, a savvy former Marine himself, recognized the power of the story. He acquired a copy of the security footage from that night. He framed a single, high-resolution still image, a close-up of Secretary Hayes's face, a portrait of serene focus amidst a blur of panicked motion. He hung it behind the bar, right next to the framed photos of Chesty Puller and Dan Daly. There was no plaque, no explanation. There didn't need to be. Every Marine who walked into the Globe and Anchor knew the story. The picture became a silent icon, a sacred object. It was a permanent reminder that the person you underestimate might be the most formidable person in the room. It became a new touchstone for the culture of the place, a symbol of a deeper, more mature understanding of the warrior ethos. The transformation of Sergeant Miller became its own quiet legend. He started a mentorship program for junior NCOs, not about combat tactics, but about leadership and character. The central theme of his first lesson was always the story of his own public humbling. He used his shame as a tool, a powerful cautionary tale, to shape a new generation of leaders. He taught them to look past the uniform, past the rank, past the superficial markers of identity, and to seek out competence in all its forms. He taught them that respect was not something to be demanded by the loud, but something to be earned by the quiet. He never saw Secretary Hayes again in person, but he followed her career with a devotion that bordered on religious. He read every policy paper she published, every speech she gave. He saw her fighting for better housing for military families, for improved mental health services, for advanced technology to protect the warfighter. He saw her using her immense power not for personal gain, but with the same focused, life-saving intent she had displayed on the floor of that bar. Her quiet competence was not just a personal trait. It was her guiding principle of governance. She was fixing the system with the same methodical precision she had used to clear a blocked airway. And in his own small way, Sergeant Miller tried to do the same, fixing the small corner of the Marine Corps he inhabited, one quiet lesson at a time. A year passed, then two. The story of the Secretary's crick was now firmly embedded in the institutional memory of Quantico. Drill instructors on the grinder at officer candidate school would use it to break down arrogant candidates, shouting, "You think you're hot stuff? You're not even fit to buy a glass of water for the woman who could rebuild your trachea with a dinner knife." The tale had become a tool, a piece of institutional folklore used to impart a critical lesson in humility and perspective. The most significant legacy of that night, however, was not in the stories, but in policy. Inspired by the events, Secretary Hayes spearheaded a new initiative throughout the Navy and Marine Corps. It was called the Trauma Response and Competency Initiative, but everyone just called it the Hayes Initiative. It was a massive, top-to-bottom overhaul of emergency medical training. It went far beyond basic CPR. Every single Marine, from a cook to an infantryman to a pilot, was now trained in advanced battlefield first aid, including emergency surgical procedures like the one she had performed. The logic was simple and irrefutable. The person closest to a wounded warrior is the first responder, and they needed to be equipped with the skills to act decisively. The initiative saved lives. Dozens, then hundreds of them. A report landed on the Secretary's desk 2 years after that night in the bar. It detailed a patrol in Afghanistan that had been hit by an IED. The corpsman was down, and a young lance corporal was bleeding out from a shrapnel wound to the neck. His airway was collapsing. His squad leader, a sergeant who had just completed the Hayes Initiative training, performed a successful emergency cricothyrotomy using the multi-tool from his pocket and the inner tube from his radio's antenna. The Lance Corporal survived. The name of the squad leader was Sergeant Miller. Secretary Hayes read the report, a slow, quiet smile spreading across her face. This was the true nature of legacy. It wasn't in a single, dramatic moment. It wasn't in a photograph on a wall or a story told in a bar. True legacy wasn't what you left behind. It was what continued forward, a ripple of competence spreading out, empowering others to act, to save, to lead. Her quiet, decisive action on one night had not just saved one life. It had created a system that would save countless more long after she was gone. The lesson had been fully learned, not just by one arrogant sergeant, but by the entire institution. It was a lesson written in policy, practiced in training, and proven in blood on the battlefield. That true strength is quiet, that competence is the only currency that matters, and that the responsibility of a leader is not to demand respect, but to build a legacy of capability in those who follow. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud arrogance, and where professional skill defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Tales.